Welcome to Peopleverse. I'm your host, Evan Troxel, and I'm an architect. Peopleverse is a show where I talk with people throughout the building industry to unearth authentic stories from interesting people to entertain and inspire. You might have heard of the metaverse. Well, we're doing something different here. In many ways, the building industry is still very much like the Wild West, even in a time when technology and data are abundant. Peopleverse explores the people and the stories behind the projects to remind us why we got into this industry in the first place and to build relationships along the way. This show is brought to you by Techt, and you can learn more about what we're doing to connect the supply and demand sides of the building industry at techt.com. And you can learn more about Peopleverse at peopleverse.fm. Joining me today is Jeffrey Potter. Jeff graduated from North Dakota State University in 2013 and started his specifications career in 2015 at HMC Architects. It didn't take long for Jeff to fall in love with specifications and the world of architecture, ultimately becoming the head specifier at HMC in 2020. Jeff is currently working at Deltek as a specifications solutions product manager, helping shift the industry toward a revolutionary approach to specifications. Jeff, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. Thank you for having me.
You have an interesting backstory. I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are with specifications and even now at Deltek. But man, what a I'll just say it. It's a crazy route that you've taken to get to there. So why don't you tell the audience what that was?
Yeah, thank you. It's unique, I'll put it that way. I'm a firm believer in if you do well in high school, you have the options to go wherever you want for college. And so I went to North Dakota State, which you think, I look back, I probably could have picked somewhere a little bit warmer. minus 40-degree winters wasn't great, but I graduated high school wanting to be a pharmacist. Actually, my brother had kind of persuaded me to become a pharmacist, and North Dakota State had a great pharmacy program. So I went through my first couple years and realized that biochem is a lot harder than it sounds. Not biochem, organic chemistry. Never made it to biochem. Organic chemistry was much harder than what I thought it was going to be, along with all the other science classes. So stopped that route and ended up following the track of criminal justice. I was already 2 years in and really wanted to be out in four. I didn't want to spend any more money on my college tuition, and so all the credits aligned with criminal justice, and at that time had decided I wanted to become a police officer. And so in 2013 I graduated with a degree in criminal justice. After that, I had worked at Costco for a little bit doing some merchandising, and then after that went and worked for Uline, which is a national warehousing shipping company, driving a forklift. During that whole time, I was trying to become a police officer at a couple different departments, and ultimately that didn't work out the way I wanted it to. And so my last couple weeks at Uline, I just really wanted a different career path, but I didn't know what that was with a criminal justice degree. You have police officer, you have probation, you have the law side of things, and didn't really excite me the way that I thought it would. And so I actually had my now wife, just apply to any job that she could find on Indeed for me.
You outsourced your job hunt. I love it.
I did, yeah, free of charge. My wife did a really good job, I'd say. And one of them was a spec coordinator at HMC Architects. And so I went in and sat down for the interview, not knowing a single thing about specs, not knowing a single thing about architecture.
Wow.
And, walked away like, oh man, I really want this job. Not necessarily because I was like, oh, I really like specs. I had no idea still after that interview what they were. I mean, they showed me the project manual and like, wow, that's a really big document. don't know how it gets put together,
Yeah,
but
right.
I'll figure it out. But I walked away thinking, HMC, they get every other Friday off. It was donuts on the Fridays that you worked, and it was like, I want that. Like, I want to work
Uh,
somewhere where you get every other Friday off and donuts. And so, I guess I sold myself well enough in the interview to land the job. And I the rest is almost history, right? I fell in love with spec writing and worked my butt off and got lucky, I think, a couple times with the way that events transpired. But you know, I remember sitting down with my mentor the first day, going over the three parts of the spec and not really knowing how that all fit together, not knowing the different spec sections, not knowing how they came together, not knowing the drawing side of things. I mean, I remember we were doing, I think it was Halloween, and we were doing like Pictionary or something in the conference room, and I was volunteered or something to be the drawer for
of
people to
course you were.
guess.
You're the
And
young person. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
and one of them was like a parapet wall, and I was like, I
What?
have no idea what a parapet wall is. And so I think I was drawing like a parrot with a plus sign and like a wall, because I had no idea. And now I think back, I'm like, well, a parapet wall is actually really easy to draw and identify, you know. And so I mean,
Right.
I started from nothing, right? Like thinking today, man, like looking at my house, it's like I used to think stucco was stucco. I didn't know the alternative word was, or actual meaning or assembly name was, Portland cement plaster. Like I remember asking my mentor Joe, like, what's Portland cement plaster? And he goes, you have stucco on your house? I said, yeah, it's that. Oh, okay. And then, sitting down and learning everything that goes into that assembly. And so, yeah, I really started from literally nothing. Like I didn't know anything, and always thought architecture was about design. Like I remember in high school, a couple people wanted to become architects, and it was always about design. And you ask me to draw a building, like I can't. Like you get a square, you get a block. Like I'm not that uh left brain, I think they call it. Like I'm not that creative to be able to picture something and put it down on paper. So I always had this wrong idea of what architecture was, and not realizing that there was a technical component to architecture, right? With the code and specifications are certainly technical in nature. So yeah, it's literally gone from zero to 100 basically in the last 6 years.
It's pretty incredible to think that you just happened into this, right? This is
Hmm.
something that happened to you.
Yeah,
You were obviously willing to do it, but
yeah,
it's very different from people who go to architecture school and are always looking 5, 7, 10 years down the road of what that education and graduation and licensure. I think the average path to licensure is something like 17 years, which is
hmm
from the time you start your education in architecture, not including any, primary schooling or anything. And so it's pretty incredible to think how architects are thinking really long term, and the projects take a really long time and they're incredibly intricate and all these things. And you're like, bring it on. I'm here for
yeah,
this. I mean,
yeah,
and it's so interesting, this path that you've taken from criminal justice to falling into architecture.
yeah. I think about it often, like the skill set needed to be a good specifier, and it's really detail oriented, and it's like, well, yeah, that's criminal justice because there was a lot of research involved, a lot of
Mm,
reading research papers and analyzing and figuring out, um, extracting data from that and how to interpret that, and that is really specifications in nature, right? You're
mm,
extracting data from written information and
mm-hmm.
figuring out how the puzzle pieces fit together. Um,
Yep.
and I saw this need. I, I look back and it's like, what's that defining moment where it was like, wow, I love specs and this is the vision that I have for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I, it was in a meeting with, you remember Paul and Joe and Sherry, and we were talking about Revit integration with specs and how that all fit together. And that was the moment that I think it really clicked for me, like, wow, we've been doing specs the same way for like 50 years. Like
Mm-hmm.
nothing's really changed. Maybe the process of producing them in terms of, it was typewriter and kind of copy machine, old time copy machine. Then it turned to, Word Perfect or Word 2000, Microsoft Word,
Yep.
and now it's what's the next step? And, there's been lots of talk about BIM and what does BIM mean, and model delivery. And the portion that I think that always gets forgotten are the specs.
Mm.
You can't deliver a set of drawings without the specs, 50% of the contract document. So where do specs fall into that? Where do specs fall into BIM? Where do specs fall into model delivery?
Right.
And that's really one of the I guess problems that I'm trying to solve now with Deltek is how do specifications fall into that? Where's their place in the future? Because we no longer want to deliver, a binder that's this thick, full of specs to a contractor when the drawings and the model are all digitized and you can pull them up on a computer. So yeah, that was really kind of the point where it was like, sky's the limit, right? Like I can be either someone that just kind of sits back and does specs the same way that everyone's been doing them for 50 years, or I can be evolutionary mind that kind of pushes them in a direction that I think that they can go.
Yeah.
Realizing that, I don't have the answer to everything, so let's reach out because there's tons of individuals, spec writers, architects, building manufacturer reps that have different perspective and might have great ideas on how to push specs in that direction.
There's so many things in what you're saying that I wanted to touch on. I don't know if we'll get to them all, but Jeff and I, just to kind of put it out there, Jeff and I worked together for many years at HMC. I was leading digital practice, and he became basically the only person, what you were calling yourself, the sole specifier at HMC, right? The head
Yeah.
specifier. And what's interesting about that is, Jeff, I'm not going to ask you how old you are, but you're young. Okay.
You
And
can
the traditional idea of a specifier in an architecture firm is a much older architect, right? I mean,
hmm
just generalizing here. I mean, I was on a meeting just the other day, and it was very much an older demographic, let's just say. And there's nothing wrong with that, but just to kind of give people an idea that you fell in love with specifications. Nobody, and I'm again generalizing, but I'm just going to put it out there this way. Nobody goes to architecture school to become a specifier.
hmm
And you talked about being detail oriented. I think some architects are detail oriented, but they usually end up being a technical architect, and they usually do end up interfacing with specifications department quite often.
hmm
But they're usually the ones who are actually figuring out the waterproofing of the building and how the things actually go together to make it buildable. And so, uh, wow, just a really interesting path on how you got there. And then I also got to experience with you kind of this evolution is a word that we could use, right? To update the process and the workflows of how specifications happened at HMC throughout the life of a project as it is in the various phases of design in an architecture office. And I think that was something that I would like to get into today. I mean, for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of firms struggling with this exact same thing. How to do that, how to update their processes and workflows, and what are the advantages to doing so, right? I think you and I were texting the other day. It's like, let's start with why,
hmm
and then we can get to the how at some point. Which I think also speaks to where you're doing what you're doing now at Deltek, right? Which is really much more on the column of the why are we doing this. I mean, the product that you're working on is a tool that becomes a how this is going to be accomplished. But got to have the tools, got to have the right workflows, you got to have the perspective, you got to speak the languages of specifiers, you got to speak the languages of architects, you got to speak the languages of manufacturers, and bring all that together so that people then have a good tool to do all of these things.
It hasn't been an easy journey, almost, because specifications are, they're last on everybody's mind. And there's this mindset, I think, of, if it's not broken, why fix it? And I would argue that specifications are broken. Mm-hmm. Right? We shouldn't be using Microsoft Word or similar platforms to produce specifications. There's this big movement, I think, right now in the industry evolving around data and what we can use for data. And specifications are all data, right? Like, you've got different products that you specify, different manufacturers that you specify. Don't you want to know, if you specify product A, if it gets substituted 70% of the time? Like, wouldn't you want to know that? Because if that is truly happening, first off, I want to know why it's being substituted. Is it because cost? Is it because of supply chain issues? Is it because it's just not a regional favorite? And if, you can find that answer to why, don't spend the time specifying it, right?
And then further reacting to that change later on down the road, burning hours to do so.
Yeah. Exactly. And you're burning hours, you're burning cash, going through that substitution. And then, you can run into issues where one project you approve the substitution, on another project you deny it. And why is that? Why do you have conflicting answers to pretty much the same question on that same product? So, specifications, I think, are just in its infancy with data-driven decisions, and looking at the processes of how they are produced and how the project manual is put together. I think it's been very stagnant, for decades. It's always been a specifier has a reactive approach. It's you sit back and the team just feeds you red lines or red marks or comments or emails, right? And a good specifier in my mind is getting out there to the teams and making them aware of the specifications, making them aware of the decisions that they have to make, making them aware of the information that they have to provide you. And I think probably even in your case, you probably get emails, or I've gotten emails where someone emails you, hey, I want a metal wall panel. Okay, like, I need more than that, right? Like, I need the whole book. I just don't need the cover.
Give me the story. Right?
Yeah, give me the story. And just off of that, there's like a bazillion questions that I just think of right off the top of my head. Well, what's the material? What's the gauge or the thickness? How's it attached? What's the finish coating? Do you have a basis of design, right? Like, that's probably the most simplest question that can be answered. And so it's really, making sure that everybody understands, what information is in a spec, how it can be provided to a specifier or team member, and then how can you extract that same information and ask the proper questions to get data from it so that you can drive, the next project decision, or you can drive master updates. So one of the first things that I did, kind of once I got, I don't want to say full control of the masters, but one of the things I did was I want to know how often each spec is used within a given year. I mean, I think the library when I left was northward of about 1,000 sections. And so you think, like, do I have time to update 1,000 sections? Like, no, I don't.
Especially how do you prioritize, right?
Yeah, you can't. And it's like, well, this section hasn't been used in 5 years, so do I need to update it? Like, how many times was it used prior to that? So one of one of the things I did was I got with someone that knew SQL and basically went in the database of the software that we were using and extracted how many times each spec was used in that given year. And from that I realized, wow, pretty much every project, like the first 50 sections are exactly the same, right? Like every project needs joint sealant, every project needs paint, insulation, gypboard, it's all the same. And so it's like, okay, I can focus on that and limit the RFIs and substitutions on those, which then give me more time and more time for others to focus on more important tasks.
Yeah. One thing you said earlier, well, there's two things out of that most recent. I'm going to start with the second one first, which is establishing context was really important for you, right? When somebody says, I need metal panel, that is too vague. And what we're doing at Tect, and I know you know this, but just for the benefit of the audience, is that a person-to-person conversation is way faster to find that information than somebody jumping on Google and typing in the words metal panel, because guess what? Like 2 billion results come up, right?
Yeah.
And so you as a specifier in a company that does certain types of architectural projects has a short list, and the various contexts that those might fit with. And so you need to know that information. That's where the kind of data-driven stuff that a lot of people are pushing out there actually falls apart, right? Which is the contexts don't exist in the data. People have the contexts. So that's just part two. Now let's jump to part one, which is you said something earlier that people usually forget about specs or they wait till the last minute. It was something, you said something to those, alludes to that. And that was really why the big driver, I think, well, that was one of the big things we wanted to change, right, with the process at HMC. And I don't know how successful it was, but the idea was, and you can probably speak more to the success or failure or wherever it landed on the spectrum there, but giving people ownership by having the specifications being driven by decisions that were made in the model was kind of the path to ownership. That's how we saw it, right? When somebody is putting in a wall assembly and they're deciding what those layers are, they're building the spec, and it's giving them a view into the specification because they're the ones adding the assembly codes to the elements so that it pulls the right section automatically into the spec. And that is a behavioral change that is easy for people to make because they're already doing the model building, but they're oblivious to the specification. Well, now we're marrying those, and it's helping. I mean, there was lots of other pieces to the process that were put in to get you on the team sooner rather than just the reactive person at the end trying to button everything up, which was a huge problem, right? When you're a sole specifier with an architectural team of 250 people with 100 different projects going on, like how do you do it all? Well, part of the answer of how you do it all is you understand the project by being a part of those teams and not just some outsourced person who sits in the corner downstairs, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that was, I would love it if you could maybe speak to some of the experiences that did come out of the shift in the process that we did there, and just to help our design community out there understand why it's important to think about a new workflow process.
I'll start by saying it wasn't a complete success, but it wasn't a complete failure. It was a learning experience for sure. And, learning that a one size approach doesn't fit everybody. We set a good process in there, right? Like most spec firms or most architecture firms with dedicated spec writers, they probably get involved around schematic design development, right? And then you communicate from your team or with the team from there, and you develop a project manual or maybe an outline spec or
they're going down the list of QA/QC for a schematic design deliverable, and like at the very end is outline spec. It's like, oh crap, we got to do an outline spec quick.
Exactly. And so it's that right there is, well, how do we engage the spec writer team or individual earlier, right? And the biggest success out of all that process revision was getting people to at least talk or think about specs, like have it in the back of their mind, like, oh yeah, I need specs by, the end of the month. Let me talk to Jeff. Let me email Jeff, right? Like that right there is a great improvement to what it was, because people weren't necessarily forgetting about specs to the last moment, or they might not have understood the process, but they realized that, oh, I can go to Jeff for questions or for Jeff to help to explain it. So, from that process redesign, if you want to call it, it evolved even more by the time I left. One of the biggest mistakes that I had was saying that I wanted to be more a part of the team and not realizing the unintended consequences from that.
What were those? You should tell everybody what those were.
Yeah, definitely. More emails, more unnecessary emails. Because when people think
just
that
CC everyone, right?
Yeah. When it was like, yeah, I want to be part of the team more so I can understand the project. It's like, okay, cool. We'll CC you on emails to our mechanical engineer.
So it's be careful what you wish for.
Yes, yeah. And I started getting more emails. I'm like, why am I in these? And it didn't hit me at first. Like, wow, I'm getting like 50 emails a day, like to the mechanical engineer, to the civil engineer that have nothing to do with me.
Multiplied by how many projects?
Yeah, like hundreds, right? And it became, kind of a nuisance, and actually having to tell people, like, don't put me on these emails. Like, unless I need to do something, like either put it in a Bluebeam session, which is where it should go, or email me. And, I took from that realizing, like, oh, me saying I wanted to be a part of the team, learn more about the project, like that was the team's response to what I was saying. And from that, I was like, all right, I'm not going to say I want to be a part of the team, but I need more information about the project so I can visualize it in my head. And earlier, right? And so prior to me leaving HMC, I set up what we had called a scope of work meeting. Scope of work meeting and a level of expectation meeting. And so we had the scope of work meeting first, and that was essentially 15 minutes understanding what the project was. Like, just show me a couple of renderings so that I can picture the project in my head. I'll develop a basic table of contents of specs from there, and we'll discuss about that at a later time. But it was essentially just, all right, here's the project. Because if you get a spec checklist, for me, it's like, okay, is this, where is this in the project? What am I visualizing? Oh, this metal panel is a soffit, not a wall panel. Okay, that can lead me to change the spec a little bit for the team at the beginning so that they're not having to do major edits on it later on. And then the level of expectation meeting, I realized we never set, even in our own job descriptions, like, what were the expectations when it came to specs? And so I wanted to learn what every team member, what their expectations were of me for that project and what I expected from them, right? And I expected communication. I expected them to update me on project deadline changes because that affected my workload, my workflow. I expected them to communicate design changes to me, product changes. And with me, some teams expected me to be a source of communication between them and manufacturer reps, or to provide insight to make sure they were making the right product decisions. Other teams wanted me, if they were younger or had younger team members, wanted me to be more like a mentor and to sit down with those team members and kind of go over specs and how they kind of fit with the drawings and details that they're working on. And so, that initial process that we had worked on probably like 3 or 4 years ago, it evolved quite a bit. We never made it into the whole Revit integration portion of it because it was difficult to get certain team members to understand that they had to add in the assembly codes. And with those assembly codes, it was just more time to the project, right? And more time to the project isn't necessarily a good thing. Even though it saved me, it cut down my work by half. It was never realized, right? Like I'd seen some teams do it, and ultimately I was working with Digital Practice to get those assembly codes into the families and smart details and stuff, but it was just taking too long. By the time I left, it still wasn't there. But that is essentially, that's where it would have gone if I would have stayed. It would have been close to a full automation as we could get. I like to think of the 80-20 rule, so automate it to 80% and give me and the team the remainder 20.
One of the things that we wanted to do was redo the entire standard detail library out of Revit components so that those assembly codes could be attached to each one of those components, which would then allow for that automation that you're talking about. And that is an incredible amount of work for the different, project typology aside. If you were just to pick one, it's a huge undertaking, because then it engaged another team, right? Which is I forget what they were called, but with the project architects, who were like a standards committee of sorts, who would decide what everything actually was going to become called, because there's 5 words for every different thing out there. So how are we going to get more standardized around that kind of thing so that we can then attach keywords to those things so that people can find those things when they're looking for them, so that the spec ultimately gets built when those detail components or 3D families get placed into the Revit and the BIM model. Wow, it's just an incredible undertaking to change all of that, and it does take years to do it.
Yeah,
and there's lots of red tape and sticky goo along the way with the teams fighting over what to call something, right? Like at the most basic level, getting beyond that is even difficult.
Gypsum board is a great example, or sheathing, right? It seemed to always defer back to, well, what do the specs say? And it's like, okay, this is what the specs
say 5 things.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so it's, you talk about the 4 C's that CSI has: clear, concise, correct, and complete. And I always like to add a 5th one: consistency. Like that's a huge part of architecture. I can't imagine being a contractor or even a bidder trying to estimate a set, and you go through and you're like, okay, the spec says gypboard, one detail says wallboard, one detail says gypsum board, the other one says just board.
Drywall.
Yeah, drywall. Are these different products, or is this all the same one? It's got to be. It's complicated, and that is something that we were fixing. But you're right; it takes years. It takes a lot of individuals to get that going, and when project hours, billable hours drive the industry, it's extremely difficult to do it on a timely basis, because by the time you do that first round of details or first round of Revit families, probably already outdated, to be honest.
Yeah, the project deadlines always win when it's competing for somebody's time to actually do that kind of work as well. And you're right, like things do evolve over time. You would hope that you would get to a point where the standards have been set and then only the standards evolve, instead of 5 versions of quote unquote standards, right? For the naming conventions, for instance. Anyway, it's a long and troubled story.
It is. And my experience is only limited to HMC, but I would imagine that a lot of other firms are going through the same problems, right? Updating, keeping up to date Revit families and details, standard details, and keeping up with industry changes. And you just talk about California alone and the changes in the code the last 5 years, having to add continuous insulation to the outside of the wall. I mean, that changes everything in terms of the assembly and how do all those pieces fit together, and how do they interact, and how does one material affect the performance of another. And just one example, um, if you have polyisocyanurate insulation, rigid insulation polyiso, and it has a foil face on it, this wasn't talked about when I first started at HMC, but now there's a recommendation that you put in a bond breaker between the plaster and the foil face, because the alkalinity in the plaster will eat away at the foil over time. And so, that's something that wasn't talked about 5 years ago. I recently learned about it probably about 2 years ago. And so, trying to keep up with all of that, and how does that affect your specifying? Do you want to specify a different product, or how does that currently affect projects in construction right now that you're working on, right? Like it has this wide impact across many different avenues within a firm. And not to change topics, but architecture, I feel like, is more scientific than what it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Building science is huge.
It's huge. Right. And as architects, even as specifiers, tens of thousands of products, like, we're never going to know everything about it. And that's where building reps come into place, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they are the experts, and the industry operates in these silos that it doesn't benefit anybody, right? And I'm not a big proponent of public bid the way that it's currently written into law now, because it promotes those information silos, right? Like, you can't really bring in a rep early on in a public bid project
and expect much out of them.
Yeah, exactly. Because why am I going to give you all of these hours if I'm not guaranteed the work at the end, right? And that inhibits the project. Why, it doesn't make sense to me, right? And so that was kind of a side mission of mine a couple years ago, and realizing that it's going to take a huge effort to kind of get the industry to realize that. Not that I want to inhibit competition or cut out the little guys, but we've got to come up with a better process of getting the key stakeholders involved early and often, and make sure that they are through the life of the project,
right.
So that we can get the best product for the owner at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many lessons learned in there. I think, maybe there's some things in there for some future episodes. I wanted to talk about your shift to what I say working in the profession to working on the profession.
Mm-hmm.
And why you chose to do that. I think you kind of set it up earlier in a nice way, talking about this kind of team to team, project to project struggle, and every team is kind of at a different place and they see a different amount of value in it. And it, as that sole specifier, and you see all these issues that you want to correct, it becomes incredibly difficult to do that at scale in a firm, let alone the entire profession, unless you go to a company that is doing it for the entire profession. So maybe you can talk about your shift to Deltek in those terms, and let us know, let me know if I'm on track with kind of laying it out like that and where you see it going.
Yeah, totally. You definitely are, because, there were a couple of reasons why I had a career change, but, one of them definitely was, do I want to have a firm impact, a firm-wide impact, or do I want to have an industry impact? And it was really, evolved around the question is, if I stay at HMC, can I impact the industry the way that I want to? And, I had a great game plan and a great vision to kind of revolutionize the specs and the process at HMC, and make it a well-oiled, well-functioned machine, right? That was going to be next-gen, evolutionary. I had a process in mind of who to hire for spec writers, how to train them, because we all know there's spec writer shortages, and so I wasn't going to go that route. I was going to go, more of an inexperienced, not even an architecture student, but someone who was at least interested
A
in
younger Jeff
specs.
Potter.
I guess, right? And trained them up to be a spec writer and had this whole plan in place. But ultimately, it was, I couldn't have a big impact the way I wanted to. And so I made the shift to Deltek because I can have that industry-wide impact in revolutionizing specs to, one of the big things that we're working on is an assembly-driven mindset. Get away from, just talking about stucco, Portland cement, plaster, and thinking of the entire wall assembly. What goes
just
into
that outer
right?
layer, right? I totally agree with what you're saying about the assemblies. And the reason I say that as an architect is because that's when, during the design process, we draw assemblies. We think in assemblies as an element. And that's how BIM works. That's how the software earlier in the design process works. Even when it's undefined, you're still thinking of these things in terms of assemblies and not individual products. And I think this is an important thing for people who are on the supply side to hear, because they tend to focus on their products and not necessarily how it's matching up with all of their nearest neighbors in these assemblies, and how much value could be brought to the project teams by bringing that information with your products to help them so that they don't have to do this level of interaction 300 times on a project, right? Because as soon as I'm done with your product, now I have to go do it for the next product in the assembly and then the next product in the assembly. Or you could have already done that and provide a super, I'll say, invaluable service to a design professional by saying, here's how it works in an assembly like this. Here's how it works in an assembly like this. And I'm willing to help you fine tune that for your application. But here's a huge head start.
Yeah. Well, even one step further, you're looking at product A, but we also have product B, C, and D, and can give you the whole complete assembly, and it's totally warrantable, right? Like that is, some of the questions that should be asked. Like if you're looking at a specific product, look at the whole assembly and see if that manufacturer has different products for that whole assembly, right? Like you look at EIFS is a great example, right? Like most of those manufacturers, if not all, have their own weather barrier, but they also provide the XPS or EPS insulation, whatever it is, and then they've got the top coats and the primers and the lath to complete that assembly. And there's other stucco manufacturers that can do that with that as well. And so, yeah, you're right. Like that assembly mindset is huge, and it's a complete shift in thinking, because when you're drawing out the assembly and you just think about stucco, right? Like you pawn it off to another individual and say, hey, go look up the specs for stucco. But how is that doing any justice, right? Because if you're making changes to just the stucco, doesn't that affect other portions of the assembly, or may it? Like it very well could, and then it gets missed, and then you can potentially end up with RFIs or change orders that just cost money and time to process. And so, it's definitely, as a specifier who's used to thinking individualistically, it's a definite change to think of things in assembly. But I think we have a good grasp on it at Deltek and where it needs to go. And, it's been, I think there's a couple more challenges down the road, but I think we've got the tools and the minds in place that we can easily accomplish that.
I think one of the interesting things about this data-driven approach, and it goes back to something you said earlier, which is you want to know what the things were that people were specifying most often, so that you could prioritize which ones to give the love and attention to when it came to updating the masters. But at a place like Deltek with the products that you're working on, you're going to be able to, it's kind of like a recommendation engine almost in terms of like what people are used to on Amazon or Netflix or whatever, where it's like, oh, I see you're looking at this product. Here's how we see it working in these types of assemblies, which gives the design professional a huge shortcut. And then you, as kind of being a platform of sorts, can then over time, see what people ultimately end up with, which is going to push those to the top of the list and give people further shortcuts. Now, I can see a huge benefit to that, but it takes the more people using it, the better, right? And that's where,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not your job, that's somebody else's job, but that really is what can ultimately benefit the whole profession is when you do hit kind of that network effect of scale of people actually using it and checking off these boxes that then drive these recommendation algorithms, right?
Yeah.
To make it easier for more people over
Yeah.
the long haul. I mean, there are countless hours wasted right now. And that's what people charge for on the design professional side, right? They charge for their time, and they're wasting their time reinventing the wheel on every single project, coming up with an assembly that's totally been done before, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Most of the time, like 99% of the time. So
Oh, yeah.
it seems like there are lots of kind of spoils to be had in this place. And again, I kind of feel like it's only really possible at an industry-wide scale, not really at a firm-to-firm scale. I mean, of course, firms would benefit from doing this. It is an incredible amount of work. But then what about all the other firms that are out there that we are all in this industry together? Like that's something that I think is another point of view that needs to be brought up.
Totally. And we have this, I think you and I have talked about it, and we developed the source specifically for it was the capture of knowledge and information from older generation employees or people within the industry.
With gray hair like this, working on project teams. And putting that in one place on like a company intranet, right? To share that information. It's still incredibly difficult to
and that's that's something
contribute.
that we're trying to get to on a much bigger scale at Deltec. But even within firms, I think they struggle with information management and how do you capture that knowledge. And just right before I left, you talk about reinventing the wheel. I mean, you talk about exterior plaster wall, something that I've specified and teams have done hundreds of times over the last 6 years, right? Someone wanted
Thousands.
to reinvent it and do something different. And it's like, why are you wasting my time? Why are you spending your time, wasting your time when we've done it this way? It works. It's proven, right? Like you're not going to have any issues. We've done it in all different types of climates in California. And, there wasn't a way to bring all that knowledge that we've spent previously trying to figure that out, trying to figure that assembly and spread it out. And bringing up informational silos. There's informational silos within firms, within the industry, and trying to break out of those. And, architecture needs to be more of an open source community, right? Like I know there's a huge risk factor in architecture. It's that thinking of we don't want to do something new because then that opens up to risk and lawsuits and all this, and we don't want to do that. And yeah, okay, that's understandable, but how are we supposed to grow as an industry if we just keep everything so close knit, right? Like, we need to be sharing information, sharing resources. It's not necessarily sharing firm secrets on how to get clients or I don't know, maybe super secretive assemblies or something like that, but common details, why aren't we sharing those? Why common assemblies, why aren't we sharing those? Why aren't we sharing, hey, this product over here, like this rep was really good, or this rep was really bad, or communication was bad, or the install was bad, or hey, we don't hold contractors accountable a lot. So it's, hey, this installer over here didn't work out really well. So just be aware. Like as architects, we should know that so that we can make sure that when we're doing CA, we can make sure that the work's being done properly if we get that installer, or hold somebody accountable to make sure that that installer is doing the job right. It just, the communication is, so close-minded, and in my mind, it's got to be an open source of sharing information, all sorts, every sort.
I mentioned earlier, Jeff, that you are a young example of a specifier, and you clearly have a passion for it. And I know you're not in the weeds, as it were, on projects anymore, and you're more concerned about it from an industry-wide level. But I'm wondering, what do you see? Because I think you're actually really good at sharing, and I think you're really good at talking about what it's like to be a specifier. I know that you've had some really provocative and compelling LinkedIn posts, and you have a blog, and you've been on other podcasts talking about this stuff. And those are other traits that I don't see in some of the older generations of specifiers, because it takes a lot of effort, right? Like, there's lots of reasons why. So what I'm wondering is, what are some compelling reasons why someone would consider becoming a specifier?
Yeah, the hours are so much better, right? Like you're not
compared to
like a
working on a project.
working on a project, yeah, right. Like you don't have to travel to team meetings. Maybe you don't have to put in the overtime. No,
you don't have to do those dog and pony shows in front of clients. And,
like specs they will always be here, right? We will never get rid of them. I don't envision us ever getting rid of specifications. Do I think that the 3-part CSI format is going to stay forever? I don't think so, and I hope not. I hope that changes. But if I had to give advice to someone who was thinking about specs and why they wanted to do specs, it's a position it's in need right now. We don't have a lot of younger generation spec writers, and so when this older generation retires, there's going to be a need. And if you're good at it, it's job safety, right? And yes, architecture firms, if there's not work, they let go of people, but spec writers are some of the last people that they let go. So job safety is huge. And also being at the forefront of, I think, this revolution that's happening in specs can be huge. I mean, we need young, fresh minds to get this ball going more and to visualize how it can be done more in the future. I think, I could be completely wrong, but this older generation, they think of this technology and it's like, it's been talked about for 15, 20 years and I haven't seen it yet. So, I'm going to be out the door in 10 years, so it's not my problem type of thing, right? Or my process isn't broken, like, let's just keep doing it that way. And it's like, yeah, but why do we need to keep doing it that way, right? Like there's better ways to become more efficient, better ways to be more productive, better ways to be more accurate. And when it all comes together, how does that tie into model delivery? I don't envision specs in 10 years being delivered to an owner for bid in a 1,000-page plus manual. I just don't. I hope not, at least. And so, as a younger individual, don't you want to be a part of something like that? That is, I think the BIM market is flooded. The Revit side is flooded with a lot of startups and individuals that are revolutionizing, a lot of aspects of Revit and kind of the whole BIM thinking. But specs, there's none. I mean, you can be a huge change leader if you want to go this route.
Yeah, there's only a few players in the specifications market, and it is ripe for a revolution. I mean, if we go back to a word you used earlier, it is in dire need of a revolution when you think about it from the perspective of making design decisions. The specifications can be a tool for making those design decisions during the process of design, not after the design has been done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we're seeing that trend with all kinds of tools. We're seeing that with rendering tools. We're seeing it with modeling tools, where these things are asking us questions earlier. They're forcing us to think about things earlier, which then leads to engaging with product manufacturers earlier, which leads to figuring these things out so that you don't have to figure them out too late when it costs a lot more money, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is kind of ripe for effort and disruption, definitely. And as Jeff says, you could definitely be a part of that. So I think that this is a great call to action. I just wanted to finish up for this conversation. I hope that there's many more in the future. If you were handed a megaphone, Jeff, and you could blast out a message for the building industry to hear, and we've probably already hit on many elements of this throughout the conversation, but what would you say with your megaphone?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And previously, I've always given the answer of get your CDT, right? And I think that's important. But I think, I'm coming off that a little bit and just saying, open the communication channels. Like, start talking to one another. Don't let risk stop you from innovating. Don't let risk stop you from communicating to manufacturers or other architecture firms. Be open-minded, be open source with that information, and put it somewhere so that it's captured. And LinkedIn's a great place to put it because it's captured there forever. But yeah, just that, if I had the megaphone, that's what I would say to the industry right now.
And you alluded to kind of this dearth of interest or talent in the specifications arena within architectural practice. But I would ask the question, who's going to solve that for you, specifiers?
Yeah.
And everybody else is worried about their own thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's really up to us. It's up to the ones who are in it to be the megaphone, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
to attract people with really interesting stories about challenging problems that are that are handled in specifications. Like, I'm sure you have stories of very weird things that have happened on projects over the years, and it's fun to dive deep and get into the building science and think about the project in these really different ways. And there's a lot of really interesting work going on in that area. And who
Mm-hmm.
better to be the megaphone for specifications, for the future of specifications, than specifiers?
Yeah.
I think that there's a huge opportunity there, and it shouldn't be missed out on. Hopefully the show can be a part of getting that message out as well.
Yeah, I would hope so. I think so. And yeah, those are all great points, Evan.
Well, thanks, Jeff, for taking the time to join me on Peopleverse today. It's been a fantastic conversation. And like I said, I'm looking forward to many more.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, Evan. I appreciate it.
Hey, before you go, can you do one thing for me? Hit the like button. It really does help us in the YouTube universe. Watching all the way to the end is probably even more helpful. So thank you for that too. It all adds up and helps more people find the show. These are great ways for you to help spread the word and contribute to the Peopleverse. If you want to help the channel even more, please subscribe and use that red button right down there and turn on the notification bell so that you'll know exactly when the next episode comes out. It's completely free to do so. And finally, do you have something to add to this conversation? If you do, leave a comment. I read all of them. I can't wait to share the next conversation with you. So until then, see you soon.